With each new day, waves from a distant past haunt the shores of North America's inland seas. Great waters of legend and mystery. Surrendering clues to their past with grave reluctance, the waters lock within their depths centuries of untold history. Hints of former cultures, long forgotten, may still be found along the wave-polished rocks that blanket their shores. Shores that remain wild, remote, and pristine. Offering habitat for wildlife, as well as living space for 50 million American and Canadian citizens. Inland seas with mighty waters, so vast they impose their power upon the region's weather. 5 Great Lakes: Superior, Michigan, Huron, Erie, Ontario. The greatest surface freshwater system in the world. Holding 1/5 the world's supply of surface fresh water, the Great Lakes stretch 1,000 miles across the heartland of the continent. Their waters flow from Lake Superior in Michigan into Huron. From there, through Lake St. Clair and into Erie. Then on through Lake Ontario and out the St. Lawrence River to the Atlantic Ocean. At a time when great waterways of the Southwest are parceled out to their last drop, water flows in abundance here, rinsing the landscape. Clean, cold water from hundreds of tributaries drain the continental interior and replenish the lakes, providing drinking water for hundreds of communities and millions of people. Food and recreation for millions more. Transportation for the commodities of 2 nations, and a source of cooling water for electric power plants and industries. But in the last 200 years, increasing human population has amplified our use of these waters 1,000-fold. Wastes from the cities and industries of 8 states and the province of Ontario flow into the lakes and their tributaries. Runoff from cities and farmland throughout the basin carries heavy loads of nutrients into the lakes, over-fertilizing the water and affecting aquatic life. The lakes have become important to millions of people for different reasons, and it is this variety of sometimes conflicting uses that tests our ability to manage and protect a great natural resource for future generations. The challenge is to balance present and future needs of the people of 2 nations with the uncertain requirements of a vast and fragile ecosystem. Rich Thomas, Canada Centre for Inland Waters.
Unless we adopt a much stronger management role with respect to the Great Lakes, we could be facing difficulties as the intensity and pressures for the use of Great Lakes water increase.
In order to get some sense of where we're heading, it is often helpful to take a look back. The Great Lakes offer no exception to this rule, for they have a past which is closely tied to the rich history and development of the North American continent. The character of their future may depend upon how well we learn from the lessons of the past. The Great Lakes were born in recent geologic time, when glaciers scoured out future lake basins by the sheer weight and pressure of mile-thick layers of ice. In the wake of retreating glaciers, early nomadic tribes moved into Great Lakes country to hunt for game and to make use of plentiful supplies of clean water. Their demands on the waters and surrounding lands were small, and the forces of nature easily kept their populations in check. So for thousands of years, the Great Lakes remained unaffected by human presence. But this would soon change. Europeans began to explore the region, In the 1600s, French voyageurs and missionaries penetrated deep into the continent by way of the Great Lakes.
No, she says she won't accept that. You must include this.
Fur trading preceded early settlement of Great Lakes country.
16 pelts for the musket. Of course, the beaver pelts are nice, but I don't like the color. So 16 pelts for the musket, and I'll give you the tobacco free. It's a gift.
European styles created a demand for furs, and Indians were eager for iron utensils and weapons from Europe. Many of our modern Great Lakes port cities, like Sault Ste. Marie and Detroit, grew up from fur trading settlements, similar to this one at Old Fort William in Thunder Bay, Ontario. People settled in remote areas of the Great Lakes Basin and began to make use of the abundant resources. The lakes provided access to these remote resources, and from the early days of the fur trade, shipping formed a critical link between distant regions with diverse needs. In the 1800s, European immigrants came to mine minerals discovered in the region, to fish the lakes, and to log vast stands of virgin white pine for a booming lumber industry. Thousands of acres of timber were cut to supply ever-increasing demands for building materials needed for the now rapidly growing cities. Locks and canals were completed, connecting the lakes and opening the gateway for interstate and international shipping of commodities and resources. Mining towns like Calumet on the Keweenaw Peninsula of Michigan sprang up during the highly productive copper boom. The mining of iron ore later became even more important to the economy of the Lake Superior region. While learning to use the resources of the region, man gradually began to leave a lasting impact on the Great Lakes and their shorelands. Topsoil, now exposed by the cutting of forests, was easily washed into lake tributaries, tainting the once clear waters. Shaded streams were warmed by the removal of forests, affecting aquatic plants and animals already living precariously close to the limits of their survivable temperature range. Commercial fishing had become an important livelihood for the new immigrants. Abundant stocks of whitefish, lake trout, lake herring, and perch were the prime commercial fish of the Great Lakes. To satisfy the demands of growing food markets, fishing techniques became more and more efficient. Trout stocks began to diminish under increasing pressure from fishermen. Nevertheless, the Great Lakes continued to provide good yields of lake trout well into the 1940s. Then, the trout harvest plummeted, first in Lakes Huron and Michigan, later in Superior. The cause was this menacing eel-like creature, the sea lamprey, introduced to the Great Lakes as a result of human change to the system. The parasitic lamprey had slowly worked its way up from the Atlantic through each of the Great Lakes after completion of the shipping canals. The sea lamprey fed on the most valuable of Great Lakes fish, the trout and whitefish. By sucking the blood and fluids from its victims, the lamprey could easily kill 5 to 10 lake trout during its lifetime. By the 1950s, sea lamprey had made their way up through the entire Great Lakes chain and were multiplying in Lakes Michigan and Superior by the millions. Faced with the complete destruction of the Great Lakes commercial fishery, scientists from the U.S. and Canada began a massive program to control the lamprey. After 5 years of testing some 6,000 chemicals, scientists found in 1957 that a material called TFM would poison lamprey larvae without significant harm to other plant or animal life. The chemical was placed in streams where lamprey spawn around Lake Superior, Michigan, and Huron. By the late 1960s, the sea lamprey had been brought under control. When lake trout were depleted by the sea lamprey and by overfishing, another invader from the ocean, the alewife, began to proliferate. Formerly kept in check by lake trout, the alewife population exploded in Lake Michigan, fouling marinas and beaches, and generally discouraging tourism. In 1966, the state of Michigan introduced coho salmon into the Great Lakes in an effort to control alewives and improve the sport fishery. The experiment was an outstanding success. Alewives were brought under control, and today the Great Lakes provide the best freshwater salmon fishery in the world. About 2 million sport fishermen fish the Great Lakes each year. more than in either the North or South Atlantic marine sport fisheries. Carlos Fedorov, Great Lakes Fishery Commission.
When people caught on to the fact that there were Pacific salmon there for the catching, the numbers of fishermen increased dramatically. It grew from practically nothing to now where the value of the recreational fishery throughout the Great Lakes is over $1 billion a year.
Like one huge biological experiment, the Great Lakes fisheries are now kept in a highly artificial state through fishery management, including trout and salmon stocking programs and lamprey control. Today, we continue to spend about $5 million each year to keep the lamprey spawning rate down. But lake trout still do not reproduce well in the Great Lakes, though they are beginning to show signs of a comeback in Lake Superior. The trout are stocked as young fingerlings each year as part of a rehabilitation program by state, federal, and provincial natural resource agencies. Here in Lake Huron, this Coast Guard helicopter is dropping young trout over a traditional spawning reef for the Michigan Department of Natural Resources. Other fish managers are trying to encourage natural reproduction of lake trout through innovative experiments. Here in the Apostle Islands of Lake Superior, the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources collects ripe lake trout, ready to spawn. Eggs collected and fertilized one day are placed the next day on reefs where lake trout once spawned in great abundance. Ross Horrell from the University of Wisconsin Sea Grant Institute assists with the project.
What we're trying to do is to look at a couple of new methods of rehabilitating the lake trout, and one of the major techniques we've been using are astroturf incubators or astroturf sandwiches, where we put lake trout eggs between two pieces of astroturf and then put them out on a barren traditional lake trout spawning reef. When these fish hatch out, that they will have the appropriate bonding or imprinting to the environmental conditions on the reef, and so that they will be able to home back to this reef and spawn there when they're sexually mature.
The astroturf should protect the eggs from natural predators until the lake trout fry hatch out. Bruce Swanson, Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources.
The goals of the project are to hopefully get back a small population of lake trout spawning on Devil's Island Shoal from these astroturf sandwiches. We anticipate about 1,000, maybe 1,400 fish coming back from the plants that we're making this year. That would probably take place in 7 to 10 years from now.
The population then will build up over time, and that's what we want to do. We want to get naturally reproducing fish rather than hatchery reared fish to be what we have in the Great Lakes.
The entire Great Lakes fishing industry has remained important to the region's economy. But the character and quality of Great Lakes fish are important for another reason.
Fish are great concentrators of contaminants. And if we can keep our waters healthy enough to keep the fish healthy, then people should be healthy.
Lake Erie. The shallow waters of this lake are used heavily by industry in both the United States and Canada. The population around Lake Erie has increased more rapidly than any of the other Great Lakes. On the U.S. shore alone, Erie receives its water from sources that flow through the great population centers of Detroit, Toledo, and Cleveland, cities that grew up around an abundance of water available for their shipping and industrial needs. Over the years, Lake Erie became a waste repository for one of the nation's most heavily concentrated industrial sectors.
25 years ago, when I first started investigating water quality here, Lake Erie smelled of sewage. There was floating debris. Mostly, it was oils from the manufacturing plants here. It was human sewage. There was inadequate treatment.
Charles Herdendorf is a professor at Ohio State University and director of the Center for Lake Erie Area Research. He grew up on Lake Erie and remembers what it was like years ago.
Well, Lake Erie at that time could be characterized by calling it pea soup. The algae bloom on top of Lake Erie was such that the boats traveling across the lake would have green wakes. It would roll up in large mats on the beach. We had problems of fish kills in some of the harbor areas. It's well known that the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland would burn from time to time due to the oil slicks.
You have to go back to like 65 and upstream from here in Lake St. Clair when there was mercury pollution. The fishing was banned from the lakes. No one from Lake St. Clair, no one could keep fish
There were two plants up along the Detroit River and the St. Clair River that flow into Lake Erie. These plants, in part of their chemical processing, used mercury, and they were disposing of about 200 pounds per day as a waste product into those rivers. They eventually came down here to Lake Erie, contaminated the biology, the fish stocks, to the point where the fish could not be eaten.
The press focused public attention on these pollution problems, and Lake Erie became the national symbol for environmental degradation. In response to public pressure, pollution control laws were put into effect, and funds became available for scientists to collect some of the basic data that would help them understand the lake and its problems. The other Great Lakes also benefited from the public attention directed at Erie. A new general concern for the lakes brought support for research projects which would help scientists understand some of the complex relationships between natural processes and the way people use the lakes. What scientists found was that, basin-wide, chemical changes in the water quality were degrading and sometimes displacing the natural habitat for plant and animal communities, and generally causing eutrophication, or premature aging of the lakes. Traces of the insecticide DDT were found in the tissues of trout and salmon. Studies linked DDT to population declines in the eagle and other birds that prey on fish. PCBs, polychlorinated biphenyls, were found in fish throughout the lakes. Like DDT, PCBs have a tendency to accumulate in aquatic organisms and to become more and more concentrated as they move up the lake's food chain. As a result, commercial fisheries were closed and people were warned to limit their consumption of some species of Great Lakes fish. Scientists detected hundreds of other potentially harmful compounds in the Great Lakes and soon began to make recommendations for their control. The 1960s marked a turning point in Great Lakes history, for in the 70s, some of the most polluted areas in the basin began to show signs of recovery.
I think people had enough in the early 60s, and there were a number of conferences. The governors of the Great Lakes states got together and decided something needed to be done and encouraged the federal government to embark on a major program. Over $5 billion have been spent on trying to correct this problem by installing new treatment plants for sewage. There have been new practices for the agricultural community on their farmlands. Things that have happened has been that the lake really has improved. These algal blooms are not nearly as intense, and we've corrected a lot of our water quality problems.
Another example of progress has occurred here in Lake Michigan's Green Bay. The northern two-thirds of Green Bay is a recreational playground with clean, cold waters typical of most of Lake Michigan. Thousands of tourists flock to the Door Peninsula each summer. But it is the southern third of Green Bay that bears the brunt of human activity. Tributaries to the lower bay have for years carried heavy loads of nutrients from agricultural runoff and waste effluent discharged by municipal and industrial sources. This 1966 photo shows industrial waste from 3 outlet pipes discharging directly into the Fox River, a major tributary to Green Bay. Stream fertility is high as a result of this collective pollution, and the waters in Green Bay are excessively turbid. But the same controls that have improved the water throughout the Great Lakes Basin have been put to use here, and Green Bay's water quality is improving. Professor Harris, University of Wisconsin, Green Bay.
Millions of dollars have been spent by industry to clean up organic material, and there have been great improvement with regard to dissolved oxygen concentrations. On the other hand, we have these newer problems that we're discovering in terms of toxic materials, and I think that's on the downside. In other words, I think that we've got more reason to be concerned than we knew about in the first place.
There appears to be a rather high incidence of biological deformities and reproductive failure found in some of the fish-eating birds of lower Green Bay. It is not uncommon to find cormorants and terns with crossbills and other deformities, like those shown here on these preserved specimens. Scientists are trying to determine whether these deformities are a result of toxic substances in the water and sediments. No easy task.
There are over 100 chemicals that have been identified. The ones that are of greatest concern are the chlorinated hydrocarbons, And the ones that we're particularly concerned about are the dioxins, the furans, and the non-ortho PCBs. And we're concerned about those primarily because they've been implicated in the incidence of reproductive failure in colony nesting birds in Canada.
In 1972, President Nixon and Prime Minister Trudeau signed a water quality agreement between the United States and Canada, which pledged both countries to protect and restore the Great Lakes. The International Joint Commission, a permanent body represented by both the U.S. and Canada, oversees this agreement. Canada has been an aggressive partner to the U.S. in attempting to enhance water quality in the Great Lakes. The major thrust of its research activity is based here in this large complex, the Canada Centre for Inland Waters. Here, scientists are looking for evidence of toxic contaminants in lower levels of the food chain. Muni Manawar, Canada Centre for Inland Waters.
Now the research is concentrating on the impact of contaminants, the heavy metals and organic contaminants, on the growth of algae, because algae is at the bottom of the trophic level, the food chain. The algae are eaten by the animals like zooplankton, and the zooplankton are eaten by the fish, and we eat the fish. So before it becomes too late to go to the fish, we'd like to know what are the effects of these kinds of contaminants on algae, so that we can develop a warning system to protect and preserve the Great Lakes.
If our work is successful, I think that we will have a very sensitive method of determining the very early influence of contaminants into the Great Lakes system, or for that matter, any other system. However, there is a danger that when we start to see these things, even at the effects level, at a low trophic level, it indicates that the materials are already present. And it seems in some way more logical that systems be developed to screen materials before they're ever used and lost to our environment.
Water from the Niagara River flows over the falls and downstream to Lake Ontario, last lake in the chain. Though it is one of the most scenic areas in the Great Lakes Basin, the Niagara River is also host to one of the most serious hotspots for toxic contaminants. Pat Chamute, Fisheries and Oceans, Canada.
I think some of the chemical firms that were located in that area had historically deposited their chemical wastes in areas which probably were not very suitable for long-term disposal of these very toxic chemicals. We suspect that there's large amounts of these materials leaching into the Niagara. It's not like trying to deal with a chemical plant which is discharging effluents directly into the river, where you know what's going in, you can measure it accurately, and you can take appropriate measures to control it. What you see in the Niagara situation is a phantom problem where you suspect that what's in those waste dumps is entering the river, but the inputs are very diffuse, they're hard to localize, and even if you do find them, tracing them back to the original waste dump is a very expensive, very time-consuming problem.
At the headwaters of the Great Lakes drainage system lies Superior, largest and deepest of the lakes. Its surface stands 600 feet above sea level, its bottom as deep as a quarter-mile in spots. Surrounding its shores are thousands of square miles of lush pine wilderness. But wild and remote as it is, Lake Superior has felt the impact of the modern world on its waters. Even here in Siskiwit Lake on Isle Royal, in the middle of Lake Superior, scientists have found PCBs, DDT, and other contaminants in the water and in the fish. In such a remote location, the only apparent source for these materials is the atmosphere, with fallout from very distant polluters entering the water in the form of rain, snow, or particles of dust. Traces of toxic substances are found accumulating in the tissue of fish everywhere in the Great Lakes. The magnitude of this problem and the potential for harm to human health is not clear today. But careful management of what we put into the Great Lakes airshed may become as important as the management of the watershed. The one troubling question is, when does our time for action run out?
Most of the problems that we've faced in the Great Lakes to date,
Rich Thomas.
We have found after the fact. We have always been in a catch-up situation, that we found a contaminant many years after it's been in place, that we have not predicted that, for example, with the opening of the various seaways into the Great Lakes system, that this would result in an influx of an exotic or more than one exotic species of fish into the Great Lakes. These have in the past been non-predictable, but since we have worked on them, we have achieved some level of understanding of the consequences of the actions we've taken in the past. If you change one thing, it may have an effect upon the other things within the lake itself, a reverberation that is occurring within the Great Lakes aquatic ecosystem.
In the last 200 years, man has altered the lakes irreversibly. We can never return the lakes to their original condition. But the lakes have improved considerably since the 1960s. The sport fisheries are now better than ever. Beaches are cleaner than they were 20 years ago. Inputs of phosphorus have been reduced, turning around the accelerated aging process of the lakes.
There has been some improvement in the older generation of contaminants, such as DDT, PCB, Mirex, mercury, and some of the other metals. However, the past 2 years we've been faced with the discovery of very minute quantities of what we call ultra-trace contaminants, things such as dioxins and furans, which at the moment constitute the greatest threat that we have to the lake.
Maintaining the present value of the Great Lakes will require continued research into the basic workings of all components in the ecosystem. It will require that we continue to monitor the pulse of the water's condition in order to foresee future problems. And it will take a carefully integrated basin-wide management strategy between the two nations that control the destiny of these greatest lakes. By virtue of their sheer size and abundance of water, the Great Lakes are apparently capable of absorbing large amounts of contamination without significant harm to the resource. The lakes also exhibit a remarkable resiliency, sometimes recovering from serious contamination in only a matter of decades. But there are limits to the demands we can place upon these waters, and those limits are not well defined. Serious changes in the lakes frequently occur before a problem becomes obvious to people. This poses difficult questions concerning our ability to protect the lakes for future generations. Can we devise effective alarm systems, for example, that will provide early warning of danger to the Great Lakes ecosystem? If, through scientific surveillance and monitoring, we are able to predict harmful impacts before they occur, how will we, as two nations, respond? The character of a precious natural resource may depend on our finding answers to these questions.
Funding for this program was provided by the University of Wisconsin Sea Grant Institute, the Joyce Foundation, the Wisconsin Educational Television Network, and WHA-TV.